Okay, class. Today we're going to look at the American Revolution. As we looked at the last lecture on the French and Indian War, the Seven Years' War, we talked about the Proclamation of 1763. And this really, as I said before, is the one that affects a majority of the American population. As far as like when you look at taxes, it's only certain segments of society looking at taxes and paying those taxes that are being increased. But a lot of those living on the borders area looking to expand, and also like some of the founding fathers were already investing in land in the Ohio River Valley that they didn't already have. This cut that all off, and this is something that was at the heart of what would become America, because they were if the one commodity or thing they were after when they came over here was land, and all of a sudden the British government said you can't have any more, and this really was the breaking point for a lot of British colonists living in North America. And I can't stress enough like the amount of money spent on the French and Indian War, 7 Years' War, was just massive. And as they were dealing on how to pay for it and how to force the colonies to pay for it, they start yet another war known as Pontiac's War, which we talked about in the French and Indian War lecture. And this was just the icing on the cake. They were done paying for the British colonists, actions in America. This was not something that England was guiding them to do. This was something they were doing on their own. But here comes Big Brother England to pay all the bills. It's like the little brother starts the fight, the big brother has to come finish the fight. They're tired of letting them have the house, and then they tear it apart with parties, or they wreck the family car and they've not paid 1 cent. So they're tired and they want to recoup that money. So they start with different types of taxes. They look to tax stuff that they think everyone buys, so therefore they can get a piece of everything being bought. And some of the early acts are the Sugar Act and the Stamp Act. Basically, everyone's hooked on sugar. There's sugars in everything today, and back then, sugar was a high demand commodity. So they looked to tax sugar, and if they could tax sugar that was going into teas and coffees and all kinds of stuff, then they would be able to, if they could just get a piece of those sales, they'd be able to get some of that money and recoup it back for the losses of the wars. Now, one other thing that really irked some colonists was the fact that if they did get caught violating the Sugar Act, not paying for sugar, buying sugar from someone else, like smuggled sugar, they wouldn't end up in like a civilian court. They'd end up in a vice admiral court, which is basically a civilian being tried in a military court where you have a lot less rights. And a lot of people thought that was, a violation of their British Bill of Rights. And the Stamp Act was an act that said, like, any kind of thing that's made out of paper that you have to purchase, you have to have a stamp on it. And this went from newspapers to playing cards to wills. Everything had to have this stamp on it. And to be honest, they passed some laws like this before, and the colonists just they protested, they demanded, they yelled and screamed, I guess through fits, and eventually the British government backed off. But this time, that was not the case. So there was early on resistance, like, let's just, work together. We don't have to buy British goods. We can buy off the black market, and therefore England will back off. And one of the bigger groups of organized people behind this is the Sons of Liberty. They would have all kinds of backroom stashes of black market goods to sell to people, so they could keep them from buying anything British in order to break the British will to try to keep implementing taxes and finally back off and leave the colonists alone. And none of those acts brought very much of any revenue to the British government. So they started just like putting taxes and acts on everything, taxing anything from lead to paint to glass to even tea, just anything they could think of. They're trying to tax everything, just trying to get some piece of the economy, some piece of the money in the colonies back to Great Britain, where they could, recoup their losses. And tensions mount as this is happening. The British government's clamping down. They're ignoring local government, replacing governors, and there's just like this rampant hatred of British everywhere, that they're taxing us, they're infringing on our rights. And this comes, these tensions come to a head in what is known as the Boston Massacre. And I know you can look at that picture that's there on the PowerPoint, and it's actually made by Paul Revere. And this is like an early piece of American propaganda. It looked nothing like this. And the reason we know what happened is we have a lot of witness testimony because this case goes to trial. What you have is a few British soldiers trying to walk down the streets and everyone's angry at them. So they're kind of like menacing them, surrounding them, and eventually start throwing stuff at them. They start coming at them with clubs and knives and pistols. And these guys just basically defended themselves. In fact, they are acquitted, because they acted in self-defense. It never would look like this, all lined up shooting. They were surrounded by a mob and just simply defending themselves. And that's what the court ruled that had happened. So it didn't really look like this, but it was just another way to drum up hatred toward the British and, give more support toward the loyalist cause of let's banding together to boycott British goods, to not pay these taxes, and just like you said, break the will of the British government so that they would just give up and back off. And the Boston Tea Party starts off with a load of tea that makes it to Great Britain, and it's rotten, and they want to toss it out, but they're like, you know what? America has to buy our goods because that's the law, so let's just send it to them. Well, word gets to the Americans before the ship does that this is just plain rotten tea that they're trying to push on the British colonists in America. And so they refuse to unload it. And then later that night, they dress like Mohawk Indians, like they're fooling anybody. And they start dumping all the tea into the Boston Harbor. What's fascinating and, an interesting side note is tea is full of caffeine. And so this tea goes into Boston Harbor. And the fish go nuts because they're so wired. They're jumping out of the water, practically jumping in boats. It's a crazy next day that gets documented in Boston News that day. Now, this was just such an open, flagrant disregard for the British government that they were done. They were like, it's time to clamp down. These guys have gone too far. We tried to ground them. They kept sneaking out of the house, and that's it. So now they're going to, clamp down even harder. First of all, they send troops into Boston. They pass martial law. They close the harbor. And one of the more, indiscriminate things is that they pass a quartering act in Boston. Now, what this quartering act meant was, to begin with, they didn't have a base there to house any troops. So they forced colonists to take troops into their homes and, take care of them and feed them. And you can almost imagine any home that might have, like, a father or mother with some teenage girls or young girls, and here's a strange man living in the house. You can see what an uncomfortable situation and how angry these people probably felt when this was happening. So at this point, the colonists realized we really do need to work together to get the British out of here, to get them to back off. So the first call comes for the First Continental Congress. Now, these men, there were representatives from all the colonies. They meet together. Now, mind you, at this point, there is a very, very few people who are talking independence or open rebellion or anything like that. Like I said, America had thrown fits before and Britain backed off. They just figured they needed to throw a bigger fit. So they needed the work of everybody. So they grew together, and they know that, the British, can be hotheads. There might be some, violence involved. So they do make some military preparations, gathering together militia and weapons and stuff. But really, they're just trying to work together to find a way to get Great Britain to listen to their grievances and back off. The British hear about this meeting and make plans to seize any weapons and break up these groups. So they start marching down into Massachusetts, and this is the famous Ride of Paul Revere, only it wasn't Paul Revere, it was Israel Bissell. It's just that Israel Bissell's name didn't rhyme well in the famous poem, The Midnight Ride of Paul Revere. And so they put Paul Revere. Paul Revere rode about 15 miles. It was Israel Bissell that made that huge run to warn everyone that the British were coming. And so everyone got ready, and getting ready meant organizing themselves and hiding weapons, moving their stashes around. When they get to Lexington and Concord, that's when the British show up. And there's militia gathered in front of the armory to impede the way of the British government. I mean, the British troops. The British demand they move. They don't move. They open fire. The British colonists react by returning fire, but not too much, and they just basically run. What they have done, though, is bought time for everyone inside the armory to get all the weapons out. So when the British finally get there, there's nothing to take. And that's pretty much the end of that, but it's the voyage home that becomes a problem for the British. So by this point, the countryside is alive with the news that the British had fired on the British colonists. So men come from all over, come running down with their guns alongside the road with the British colonists marching its way back. And from behind trees or different places, they take pot shots of the British column. The British lose more men trying to get home than they did in the entire battle. Okay, shooting has started. So there's a Second Continental Congress, and now we need to get more organized when it comes to the military. And at this point, there's been a guy showing up both these congresses, dressed in his uniform, standing out for everyone to see, and that's George Washington. He's kind of been advertising himself to lead the army. And because he does have previous combat experience in the French and Indian War, he is chosen to lead the army, and he becomes commander of the Continental Army. Now, they're still debating what is going to happen next. They're still thinking maybe we can somehow work something out. There's still not a majority opinion for war. Now, the first real organized skirmish is the Battle of Bunker Hill, which was actually fought on Breed's Hill. And it's telling in the fact that the British have no respect for the American army. The Continental Army is actually on a hill, on a fortified position, as you can see in that picture there, and that's the best place you want to be in an army. You want to be on the high ground in a fortified position, which is exactly where they were. Now, these muskets are notoriously inaccurate, but they're pretty much accurate when all you got to do is shoot down. So as the British troops are trying to go up the hill, all they got to do is aim down, and that ball is going to hit somewhere. And so this went on, and it's one of the most devastating battles for the British Army in a long time. They literally lose 1,000 men. 450 colonists die. They eventually have to back off the hill, not because they're being overwhelmed, but because they run out of ammunition. So when this battle's over, the British government realizes, this is going to be a long fight. And they're just the amount of British soldiers that were hit was just incredible for them. They hadn't lost that many in a long time in one day. Now, just as the shooting starts, they still try one more time to make some peace. Like, oh, we're sorry we killed 1,000 of your soldiers, Mr. King, but please forgive us, our bad. But by that point, the King George didn't even want to hear it. Throws it in the trash, and that's it. It's war. We need to really push these people down and put them in their place. So at this point, there's a war. But, what is this war all about? And so by this point, people are talking independence. And so they're looking at, how, do we convince people this is what's going on? And there's a writer known as Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine was recruited by Benjamin Franklin. Thomas Paine had been writing pamphlets organizing strikes of workers in Great Britain. He considered himself a citizen of the world, not a citizen of one particular place, promoting equal rights for all. And so when Benjamin Franklin runs into him, he's like, where you need to go? You need to come back to America with me. And, we could use you. And as the shooting starts and everything, he's like, well, I need to give the American people, an understanding of what's going on. So he writes this pamphlet called Common Sense. It is widely distributed and read. And the gist of it basically is, wake up, we're at war, pick a side. And in there is, a lot of what is going on in Europe and made its way to Americas, and that's the Enlightenment. These ideas on new ways of envisioning government. You have John Locke saying, we all are born with natural rights. And the only reason, Well, the natural rights are life, liberty, and property. And then Rousseau follows him by saying, we don't need government. The only reason we have government is to protect those natural rights, life, liberty, and property. That is the only reason we have government. So if we ever have a government that violates those, we have the right to get rid of it or change it. And mind you, in John Locke, when he points out those natural rights, he says these rights are before law, that law recognizes the rights, meaning these are long before any kind of government. We are all born with these. And Rousseau, like I says, go further and says, like, if those rights aren't protected by our government, then we get, or have the ability to alter or get rid of it. And this is the language that you'll find later in the Declaration of Independence. Now, there was a group of people that were assigned, but it was mostly Thomas Jefferson that gets assigned this task of declaring to the world what this war is all about. And so he writes the Declaration of Independence, in which he infuses all those thoughts of John Locke, Montesquieu, Rousseau, and he just points out, is like, this long list of grievances of what Great Britain did to violate those natural rights, and says, this is why, we are rebelling. This is why we deserve our independence. Now, what's interesting is he first turns this document in to the Continental Congress, and they all gather together to look at it, and then they just like a teacher with a red pen, they just start crossing stuff out, because he talks a lot about slavery, and he posits maybe it's not a good thing, maybe the United States should get rid of it, even though he's a slave owner himself. We'll get more into that later. But the Continental Congress is not having it because they need the support of the Southern colonies, so they can't talk about slavery. So they start tearing this thing apart, and Thomas Jefferson's just getting redder and redder, madder and madder, and Benjamin Franklin sees him and knows how mad he is, so he grabs him and takes him out of the room. And Benjamin Franklin's really, loves to tell stories. He always has a story for everybody, and he tells Thomas Jefferson, "Look, I know how you feel. You didn't know this, but I used to make signs. I was a sign maker. And one day I had this guy come in. He had a hatting company, and he wanted on this sign his name, a hatter, sells, repairs, rebuilds hats, reblocks hats, and, all this little description of what his company does. So he leaves, and Benjamin Franklin gets to work. Then his partners start coming one at a time, making changes. And Benjamin Franklin tells Thomas Jefferson, do you know what sign that man has above his door right now? Just a picture of a hat. Because that's all that's left the sign. So all the work he had done, it just got reduced to a hat. He's like, so don't feel so bad. So eventually they get a final version after all the crossouts. Everyone signs it, and there's the big a signature of John Hancock, who said, I want everyone to know I signed this paper. And so therein lies, now they tell the world and the rest of their countrymen what this war is all about. Now, what you have to look at and understand about the American Revolution, it is literally the first civil war in America. Because there was a lot of families, much like the Civil War, that were torn apart. There were loyalists and there were patriots, some within the same family. The best example is Benjamin Franklin. He was a patriot. His son was a devout loyalist. And after the war, they never spoke again for the rest of their lives. His son moves away and lives in Britain when the war is over. Also, you have to understand that this war isn't fought by very many people. And the reason is if you rebelled at this time and anywhere in the world against a king and you lost, you would be beheaded. You would be hung. It was, you have a death sentence upon you. So a lot of people didn't want to get in the way. Most of them stayed in the middle because, to be honest, they weren't going to get anything out of it. Slaves are still going to be slaves. Poor people are going to be poor people. And there was no real change for most of society because of this war. So a lot of people didn't involve themselves in the war. A lot of them just tried to stay in the middle. And so the war is really, especially when it comes to patriots, fought by extremists. Now, the war doesn't go well for George Washington at the beginning. But you know what? It doesn't have to, because George Washington knows what great generals know. You don't have to win a battle to win a war. Thinking about winning battles and that solely alone is short-sighted thinking. Sun Tzu, the great Chinese military theorist, led a huge rebellion against a large army with a small army, and it's other people that have learned his tactics. In fact, the tactic becomes known as the Fabian defense because General Hannibal invades Italy, and he never loses a single battle. So finally, General Fabian's tasked to fight him, but General Fabian knows I can't beat him, but I can do something. I can just keep Hannibal in the battlefield so long, it gets so expensive, he grows so tired, people back home are tired of the war, and the war will come to an end. And that's kind of what happened. And this is kind of what George Washington is thinking as well, the Fabian defense. I can't defeat Great Britain. There's no way. I can't protect all the cities, because that was the thinking back then. You take all the cities, the war is over. But Washington knew as long as he had an army in the field, the British would have to keep chasing him. And the longer he could stay in the field with his army and they had to field their army, there goes more taxes back home. There's more loss of life, more blood, and the people eventually get tired of the fight and start to protest and want an end to the fight, which is exactly what happened. In fact, I went to a military college, and in one of our classes, they always make us put together the American Revolution and the war in Vietnam, because the ends are the same. When you look at Vietnam, we're the British invading, the homes of these Vietnamese who can't defeat us outright, but they can keep us in the field so long. They don't have to win any battles. We won all the battles, but it would be so long, so expensive that people grow tired of it and eventually bring it to an end. And that's exactly what George Washington did. He didn't have to win battles. He won some, but he didn't have to win a lot. He just had to be in the field long enough for Great Britain to finally give up, for the people back home to force them to give up, because there's a lot of war protests going on back home. I'm sorry, the last slide there was a mention of Saratoga. That's the turning point of the war. What happens at Saratoga is at the same time as the war's being fought, the colonial government knows that they can't win. So one other gambit they play is they try to get France to come in on the war because the French hate the British anyway. At first, France just not too sure because, we're not doing too well. They're like, we're going to back the wrong pony here. They give us a little bit of money, a little bit of guns, but they're weary about sending everything until the Battle of Saratoga. In the Battle of Saratoga, you had the colonial army versus the British army, and standing toe-to-toe, and the colonial army finally wins. In fact, the hero of that battle will later be a villain in American history. His name was Benedict Arnold. He was wounded in the leg in the battle as he drove forces forward. He was the hero as the American forces were trying to back off. He drove them forward. They defeated the British army, and all he ever wanted in his life was to be a battlefield general. And he's like, I finally did it. I saved the war. I'll get to be. Washington shows up. He sees him. He's lost his leg, and he's like, he feels bad for him, but he wants to give him something. So instead of making him a general in the battlefield, he gives him, he promotes him to colonel and puts him in charge of West Point, which is a fort. And this to Benedict Arnold was the last straw. He was just so angry. He didn't get what he wanted. Now, the British had spies everywhere. George Washington had spies everywhere. So they knew Benedict Arnold wasn't happy. They approach him. They offer him a generalship. They offer him money and lands in England. And he takes it and he gives the plans and the keys to West Point to the British, betraying the American people. But going back to the Battle of Saratoga, since we beat them, France finally felt good enough to send their army, send money, and also send a navy, because we didn't have much of a navy. To be honest, we didn't need too much of a navy because most of the battles were being fought on land. But the navy was crucial in the final battle at Yorktown, because by this point, the French army and the colonial army have surrounded a British force. Their backs are to the ocean. Normally, this wouldn't be a bad position to be in because the British have a great navy and they could either get more support troops or they could at least get on boats and get out. Only problem is the French navy is blockaded that area, and no British vessels are coming in, so they're completely surrounded. They have to surrender. And back home, like I said, there are people getting tired of the war, and they're like, why do we keep this up? Look, we're already losing. We lost a whole army. What's the point? We were just trying to get some taxes back, and then we spent, 80,000 pounds of taxes is what they wanted, and we spent like 1 million pounds. This is bad math. Let's bring this war to an end. And so it does come to an end. With the Treaty of Paris in 1782, Great Britain recognizes the independence of the United States. Mind you, there's a whole bunch of Treaty of Parises. There was one that ended the French War. Here's another one. You'll hear a lot more about Treaty of Parises. One thing, though, to note is Britain recognizes our independence, but we're not really independent because we're still economically dependent on Great Britain. And this is one of the many reasons they decided to back off, is because really, even with the smuggling and everything, pretty much most of the goods we were getting was from Great Britain. And once the war's over, we would start to trade with them again. So, why are we hurting business? So, Great Britain knew we didn't have a manufacturing capacity, so we're still going to have to buy most of our goods from them. And so, we become independent in recognition, but economically, we were still very dependent on Great Britain. It's not till the Second War of Independence, the War of 1812, that we finally become economically independent, and we'll get to that soon. So, we won. We got a country. Now what? We need to see how this country is going to be shaped. Like, how do we even make a country? How do we run a country? And at the center of the debate that goes on to this very day, Washington warned against a two-party system, but that's exactly what we've been. And at the heart of these two parties, no matter what titles they give themselves, there are the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. Federalists are people that support a strong central government. Anti-Federalists are people that support a weak central government and strong state government. Over time, these different parties have called themselves different names, but this is the core of their being. So they might have different political platforms, but in the end, they're driven by whether they want a strong central government or a strong state government. Currently, the ones allied like that, if you look at Federalists, would be Democrats, and Anti-Federalists would be Republicans. Now, since the inception of the war, when they organized themselves, we were organized under the Articles of Confederation. It was a simple document that was very limited in what it could do, but it was enough to allow the 13 colonies to work together. It gave each state one vote, regardless of population, and kind of split the power between national and state government. It established, them to work together so they could coin money, make war, run a post office. It also had the very important provisions on how to add states, because as the war was progressing, they were trying to get more territories to align themselves, with the United States and become part of the United States. So they already had provisions to make, to add states into the Union. But that's about it. When the problems were, it could not collect taxes. Each state had one vote regardless of population, didn't have an executive branch, no national court system, so laws changed depending where you lived. You needed 9 out of 13 states to agree to change any law. There wasn't no real lack of unity that came from it, and it had a very weak central government. But back to the top of the list is the main issue of the day: taxes. Governments need taxes to function. That's how they work. Without taxes, you don't have a government. But more so, to fight the war, these states and the United States had borrowed lots of money. War is over, and these people want their money back. And how can you pay them back if you can't get taxes to get revenue coming in? So these other countries, were like, well, you can't pay us back, but we'll take Virginia. You know what? You owe us X money, we'll take Vermont. We'll take Rhode Island. We were literally in danger of getting the country repossessed just as it was being born. So this is a major issue that had to be addressed. Before we could do anything, in order to exist, we had to be able to collect taxes, pay our debts, and then basically run and function and get a government that functions. And to put icing on the cake, there was a rebellion known as Shays' Rebellion. What were they rebelling about? Go figure, taxes. We had a whole revolution, taxes. And once again, that government tries to put taxes on people, and they rebel. They have to call Washington out of retirement to put this down, but this really showed, because there was no other way. There's no army. No one wanted an army. There was no police force. There was nothing to put these people down. So we needed to do something because our country, our government was falling apart. So a group of different delegates from different colonies get together in what's known as a Constitutional Convention. This is actually done in secret. And the reason they have to do it in secret is because If everyone knew about it, everyone would show up, everyone would want something, and nothing would get done. There'd be too many hands in the cookie jar. So they needed to limit who was there. Later, they could ask for approval, but they needed to limit who was there so they could get some work done. Immediately, there was a problem. How were we going to divide up the government? So there's two plans that initially get put forward. The Virginia plan, which says we should have a bicameral legislature, which is basically two different houses based on state population. The New Jersey plan said one house and one vote per state. Now, so if you're a state with very small population, you don't want the one based on state population. And of course, if you're a state with a large population, you're like, why should their votes matter as much as ours? We have more people. So, this was going back and forth. So in walks Roger Sherman with a great compromise. He says, okay, we'll have two houses. We'll have the lower house, the House of Representatives, which is based on population, and the upper house, the Senate, 2 reps per state. Then you have a mixture of both. And the idea behind this is any law that needs to get passed before it makes it to the president's desk must go through to both houses. And so they say, well, at least, one way or the other, people will have a hand in what's going on. At least that was the theory behind it. Now, the problem becomes the South being super hypocritical because the South still wants better representation. Because if you count a population in the South, and you're only counting white people, which is what everyone was doing at the time, the South was outnumbered. But if you counted all their slaves, all of a sudden their population boomed. And here they were calling slaves property, saying they have no rights, they're not even human. And all of a sudden when it comes to the returning population, oh yeah, we should count them. Being super hypocritical. And to make it worse, this is put into the Constitution. Their compromise is the 3/5 compromise. Basically, a slave is 3/5 a person. Very, very tragic and sad, and something that goes into our original Constitution. Now, they've settled the representation. It's like, okay, now the system of federalism is created. Like, who's going to have power over what? And this is known as federalism. Who has power over the mail? Who has power over commerce, trade, education? We're going to break this up into different spheres of influence for different governments. So you have all kinds of governments. You have federal governments. You have district governments. You have state governments. You have county governments. You have city governments. You even have school governments, each of which has its own sphere of influence, each of which is designed for certain segments of society. In a sense, though, it is creating a situation where they think or hope that everyone will have access to government. And another reason to do this is to balance the power, spread it out amongst the federal and the states and the local and so forth. And this is their way of not putting too much power in one area, and hopefully to compromise between the Federalists and Anti-Federalists. Now, the Constitution lays out enumerated powers, which are powers that are specifically labeled in the Constitution. They say, you have the power to coin money, power to make post offices and stuff like that. Those are enumerated powers labeled in the Constitution. But then you have Article 1, Section 8, the implied powers, which basically says that because you have the power to coin money, then you should, then it gives Congress the flexibility of figuring out how. So we have to create the Treasury. We have to create the post office and all these things. So this implied powers are powers given to Congress so they can support their enumerated powers. Now, the 10th Amendment basically says anything not labeled in here, that stuff goes to the states, reserved to the states. So the states have powers as well. Sometimes, they're very wide and some are more limited, but, within the purview of the state, they have, police force, they can enforce contracts, traffic laws, land use and so forth, and regulate the borders within their states. Then you also have concurrent powers. These are powers that are held by both the federal and state government at the same time. One famous example is the income tax. Now, we live in Texas, which is one of the few states that doesn't have a state income tax. Most states do. So when your parents file for a federal income tax, they'd be filing for a state income tax. These are powers that both the federal government and the state government share. They can both establish courts. You can have federal courts, state courts, county courts, local courts, and so forth. They can both charter banks and corporations. All these things can be done by both federal and state government. They're known as the concurrent powers. Now, following one of the Enlightenment philosophers' idea, his name was Montesquieu. He was like, we shouldn't put all the power in one place. So he comes up with the separation of powers doctrine. And this is kind of what frames our Constitution. We create three branches: the legislative to make laws, the executive to enforce laws, and the judicial to check laws. And this was so the idea was that no one had all the power. Now, through our history, as we'll study and move forward, different ones of these branches have a little bit more influence in society than others. Some have more power than others at different time periods, depending on what's going on. But in the end, they're trying not to concentrate power in any one branch. So they're done. September 1787, we finished the Constitution, and people go crazy. They're so relieved to be out of that building. They were in there in the summer with the windows closed so no one could hear what was going on. And they just explode. They run out. They're like, oh my God, it's over. Thank God. But it's not really over. Because now they have to take that plan they just made back home to their states and get them to approve it. And so here comes another fight between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. The Federalists, once again, strong central government. Anti-Federalists, weak central government, strong state government. And so as the Constitution is making its rounds, these guys, it's Federalists like, James Madison, the father of the Constitution, and you have the Anti-Federalists on the other side, like Patrick Henry. These guys are having like an open debate. Nowadays, you probably see it on social media, people commenting on each other. Back then, all you had was newspapers. So each one of them and some others would write these essays promoting federalism or anti-federalism. They would use pseudonyms, which is other names, like, made-up names, but everyone knew who they were. And this is how they had their debate in the newspapers. One side would print something, the other one would print a reaction to it, and going back and forth, each of them touting which one is better, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. The Anti-Federalists were against the Constitution as is. Their major problem with the Constitution was it had no Bill of Rights. And that was the biggest sticking point. This is why they told people not to sign the Constitution yet, because it didn't offer a Bill of Rights. Now, the Federalists were saying that, the Constitution is written so well, you really don't need a Bill of Rights. You're protected. And these people were saying, we were British citizens with a British Bill of Rights, and you saw how that ended up. We don't trust you. We want a Bill of Rights. And there was protests all over the country forcing the amendment of the Bill of Rights, the addition of the Bill of Rights, excuse me. And so if it wasn't for the people arguing and protesting and, demanding protections, demanding guarantees of certain things like freedom of speech, freedom of the press, right to assemble, right not to self-incriminate and so forth, all these rights that, we hold dear nowadays wouldn't have existed if it wasn't for the people pushing it. Once the Bill of Rights was added, the Constitution was finally adopted and it became the law of the land. And they tossed out the Articles of Confederation. Now, one of the best parts of the Constitution is known as the Elastic Clause. We are a young country, but we actually have the longest serving Constitution. And the reason is this. The Constitution was written in such a way that you can always change it. You could always add or subtract. The Constitution is part of its time, and it knew that. It didn't, they didn't know what was going to happen 30, 40, 50 years. So, they left it such as that we could make changes. And sometimes, you can add new amendments, or sometimes if you add an amendment and it doesn't work out so well, like prohibition, they repeal the amendment. So it allows itself to be as flexible and change with the American people. And that's why it's still around today. Now, once they have the Constitution, now we have the American government as we realize, as we see it today. And the very first president elected under that Constitution is George Washington. Now, back in the day when this was going on, you didn't campaign. It was considered like ghetto to campaign. Basically, people put your name forward. Your reputation alone would carry you, and that's how you got elected. And that's exactly what happened to George Washington. He was literally at home when they came and told him, hey, dude, you're president. And George Washington, even when he was fighting the war, all he ever wanted to do was go back home. He was sending letters home, talking about, "Oh, I'm going to remodel this. We're going to add this to the house." Always thinking of home. So when the war was over, he went home. When he gets the news that he's president now, he realizes, well, I helped make this country, bring this country into fruition. I might as well give it a push start. So he accepts the presidency, and pretty much everything you know about the presidency, as far as what they do and the way the office is shaped, was shaped by George Washington. Everyone just kind of followed his precedents. Like, one thing is he only served 2 terms, then stepped down. At the time, there was no law that said he couldn't keep running. He couldn't be an emperor, and live this whole life as president for life. That's not what he wanted. So after 2 terms, he stepped down, and pretty much every president after him has followed him until you get to FDR. We'll learn about in the second semester. After his 3rd term, they passed a law saying to limit terms. But at this time period, George Washington could pretty much have done whatever he wanted. But, that's not the type of person he was. He accepted the presidency, and he went about like trying to create the office. Like, the first thing is like, what do you call? He's not a king or anything. So they finally coined the term Mr. President. And the first rule of law was like, we need law. So, even though they create the judicial branch, it's time to actually make it physically real. So they create, the Supreme Court, federal court, district courts, state courts, county courts. All this whole system was created, leaving the Supreme Court the supreme law of the land on top, but allowing for a uniform system of justice throughout the states. He also knew he couldn't handle everything by himself, so it starts small. He starts with his cabinet with 3 positions. Secretary of State, that's the person who negotiates with other countries. That's Thomas Jefferson. Secretary of War, Henry Knox. And Secretary of the Treasury, to get us back on a good financial footing, because at that time it was horrible, was Alexander Hamilton. Incidentally, a lot of the founding fathers did not like Alexander Hamilton. But George Washington always protected him and stood up for him, because of all the founding fathers, he's the only one that served in the war with him. He was his aide-de-camp. Now, it starts out with 3 branches, but you got all kinds of members of the cabinet. The bigger and more complex a society is, the president can't be everywhere and know everything. So he appoints people to take over different positions of government and just kind of keep them informed. He'll guide them, but they do the day-to-day work. Now, like I said earlier, we were in bad financial straits. And so Alexander Hamilton decided to, the best way to get things straight is he's trying to get this country on a better footing. He wants this country to be something that people would want to trade with, create a good, trade network inside the country and outside the country. But in order to do this, we had to be on better financial footing. So he proposes the creation of a national bank. This was very controversial at the time. People were like, that's too much money, too much power for the federal government to control the nation's money. But he understood that if they didn't do it, if they didn't regulate banking one way or the other, our country was going to fall apart in financial ruin. And there would be no country that would negotiate trade deals with us or anything. So he's like, we need to have it. And one of the ways he finally sells it is many states incurred debt to others during the war. So Hamilton says, you know what? I'll buy the debt off you if you join the National Bank, meaning we're going to wipe your credit clean. Like, you're going to be back in the black. You just have to join the National Bank. Eventually, it is created, but only a limited charter, meaning every few years they had to recharter it. Otherwise, it would cease to exist. And the National Bank becomes an issue of debate and, presidents going like, I support it, I don't support it, for a long time after this. We'll hear about this later, as we move forward in the study of our history. Now, like I mentioned before, as Washington warned us against, but we still did. We end up, with the 2-party system. You had Democrat Republicans. They've called themselves different names, but they've always been Federalists, Anti-Federalists. You can have Democrats, Republicans, Democratic Republicans, Whigs. But in the end, at their core is always Federalists and Anti-Federalists. One of the big major uprisings beginning in, at the early onset of the country is the Whiskey Rebellion. Once again, people don't want to pay their whiskey taxes. This still happens to this day. There's lots of people who don't like to pay whiskey taxes because, you're too young to know this, but alcohol has what they call a sin tax. So does tobacco, which basically sales tax is 8%. It's a percentage above, they add more to it. So you pay more for it. Then so that's why people create moonshine, hide liquor, run liquor, all kinds of stuff. So this is nothing that we don't still experience today. At that time, it was a major uprising of people. Washington had to put together 13,000 troops to suppress it. And it sets precedents once again. Washington sets precedents that the federal government, the executive branch, will act, to protect the nation. Washington steps down after 2 terms, and it's down to 2 guys who are running for the presidency: John Adams, Federalist; Thomas Jefferson, Anti-Federalist. Adams wins, but get this: back then, when you had a presidential election, it doesn't happen anymore, of course, but you can only imagine how that would play itself out. But the winner would be president and the loser would be vice president. You can almost imagine what that would look like today, but that's how it was back then. One thing to emerge during the Adams presidency is a conflict with France. Now, our American Revolution doesn't do too much worldwide, but the French one does. It disrupts all of Europe, restructures society in Europe. And so, in the midst of the revolution, the French Revolution, the French government reaches out to the American government because they helped us during our revolution. And they're like, hey, can you guys help us out? And the American government's like, we're sorry. Like, we're still building a country, and we'll get back to you later. We never do. France is quite angry. And so, in the midst of all this war, France starts to attack our ships that are, our trade ships that are going by to, sell goods. They start to attack them. Eventually, they've captured some of our ships. We send diplomats to France to negotiate this. The French government doesn't even want to deal with us. They send us like the office help, which they refer to as XYZ. And, the American government feels insulted. And we have what we call a quasi-war for about 2 years between us and France. With so much rebellion going on in Europe, and this fear that it's our country was born out of rebellion, might fall again to rebellion, a very controversial set of laws is passed known as the Alien and Sedition Acts. It did a couple of things. One, it increased from 5 to 14 years you had to be in residence in America to become a citizen. But the one that hit everyone hard and said it was a violation of our First Amendment was there was laws made to where you could not speak out or criticize or make statements against the government. Otherwise, you'd be jailed. People saw that as a flagrant violation of our First Amendment. Very unpopular acts that are eventually nullified by a lot of states by just not enforcing it, because a law really isn't law if you don't enforce it. So a lot of states end up nullifying these laws. And that won't be the first time they nullify law. We'll talk about that soon. But that's all I have for you today.